Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, this week's Torah portion finds us deep in the soliloquy that Moses is giving to the people of Israel as they get ready to leave his leadership and go into the land without him. And we've seen already philosophical teachings, theological teachings. We spoke a couple of weeks ago about the idea of choice and blessings and curses. But this week takes us in a different direction. This week we see real rubber meets the road commandments, right? Of how we should live our lives. And this isn't, at least on the surface, how we should live our lives vis-a-vis God, how we should live our lives vis-a-vis the tabernacle or the temple when it's built, but this is how we should live our lives in relationship with one another. And one of the critical pieces of our tradition begins in chapter 22. And I'd like everybody to open up the red books. Oh, actually, I can't say the red books anymore. They're both red. The larger of the red books that are in front of you, to page 1115. 1115. Chapter 22. If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass, with his garment, so too shall you do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. So let's unpack this particular mitzvah, this particular law, because it's unique in some ways and actually then very traditional and very common in other ways. So what are the lessons that we learn from this, right? The base lesson, I'll start off for everybody. The base lesson is, if you find something, you give it back, right? We do not have the concept, at least according to the Torah here, of finders keepers. That's not our shtick, right? Later on, if somebody hasn't taken it for a while, you can assume that somebody has lost hope of ever getting that object back, well, then maybe you can keep it. But if it's identifiable, if you think that that person actually still is longing and has hope to get that object back, then we're required by Jewish law, by the Torah, to do whatever it takes to get this object back to the person. So why do we think this particular law is so important? That Moshe actually gave a whole paragraph about it, not just a simple line. He could have just said, return lost objects, moving on to the next commandment, right? Why do we think this is so important? What do you think? I'm going to throw it out to the group here for participation. Why do we think this is so important? Mark?
Just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
As slaves, you don't own possessions.
Mm.
And so now that you're getting paid to have possessions, there might be a sense of greed or sometimes you bored when you haven't had it before.
I like that. So what Mark said, for those who are playing on our home game, right, is as a slave, you don't have possessions. Nothing is really yours. It all belongs to the taskmaster. It all belongs to whoever your owner is. And maybe, Mark is arguing, that now that you have possessions, maybe there's going to be a sense of greed or a sense of hoarding, right? Well, I found this, now I'm going to keep it. Forgetting that it actually belongs to someone else. Good. Why else? Why else might this mitzvah be so important? Sophia? Mm-hmm. Good. Sophia is arguing that this is a statement on how important community is, that you have to look out for your fellow human beings. Good. Why else? Anybody else? So it's interesting to me, I see multiple commandments within these sentences. There's the command to return the lost object, right? And then there's the command, which is actually repeated twice, in the beginning and the end, to not remain indifferent. Right? Not remain indifferent. Let's dig into that a little, because what does that mean? What happens when we live in a society in which indifference flourishes? What happens when we live in a society where the focus is so much on ourselves, right? Maybe, as Mark was saying, because we were slaves, maybe thousands of years later, like today, when we haven't been slaves in a long time, and yet society promotes this idea of me as an individual, I am the most important thing. What I need in order to make me happy is more important than anything else. All right, we got some hands going up. I like that. So Yvonne is arguing that if we remain indifferent and we don't create that sense of community and connection, on the surface it may appear as if we're taking care of ourselves because we're putting our needs first. But the reality is that there's going to be nobody else there to care for us when things get out of our reach, when things become too difficult for me to handle, for me to deal with by myself, right? We certainly can go and live off the grid, but it's kind of nice that I have electricity in my house. Thank you very much. Right? Now, I don't want to be out there trying to figure out how to generate that electricity. It's great that I live in a community and a society in which we've all decided together, okay, we're going to pay, sometimes a little bit exorbitantly, but we're going to pay, right, for that to be able to happen. So we all can have that. Okay, yes.
I think, to your point, it's a sense of collective responsibility. And what's interesting in terms of the grammar is that this is in the singular.
Mm-hmm.
Where a lot of times we see things that are, the commandments are in the plural, like for everybody, or even coming up on Yom Kippur, we have this Ba'ashamu, everything is still in the plural. But here, it's singular. I'm thinking it could either be to the singular person or like to the community at large. So if you just have this indifference, you get into really it'll ultimately create chaos.
So, Diana, I like what you're saying. Let me just repeat it so people can hear, which is grammatically, and you are absolutely correct, grammatically, this commandment is in the singular. A lot of commandments are in the plural to all of us as a people, as a community, as the world, whatever it may be, right? But this is you. You need to return that object. You cannot remain indifferent, right? And it's powerful because how often is it easy for us to say, somebody else has got this? Somebody else has got this. I know that I can, I should be helping or whatever, but somebody else has got this. And we see it all the time. I mean, just the other day, I was driving down one of the streets, and there was an accident. And, right, how often do we say, well, somebody else has got this. Somebody else will call 911. Somebody else will stop and help. Somebody else, I don't need to because somebody else will do that. Well, obviously, if everybody says that, nobody's stopping. And we don't have anybody. So this command to each one of us says, no, the responsibility is on you until problem is solved. Until the problem is solved. And by the way, the Talmud goes to great lengths to say, if you have to take this person's ox into your farm, you got to feed it. You can't let it die. Maybe it's going to be 3 months, 4 months. Maybe you're going to have it for a year. That's a lot of money that you're going to have to put out potentially. Or if this is an object of something that you know, right? Hey guys, we got to turn off all electronics. Sorry, all electronics have got to be off. So if you know that this is an object, this is something somebody left this, and I don't know. Let's say you find something at a what used to be a Chargers game here. I was just thinking about that. You go to a Padres game and you see, that this is something that the Marlins left or something like that. Well, maybe they don't live here even. How are you going to find? And our tradition actually tells us we have to go out of our way. We have to go out of our way because of the command, do not remain indifferent. You can't just sit and wait. Anything else? Before I want to share with you the way that our rabbis sort of transformed this idea from a basic idea into a much broader one. So, Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed kind of gives us the basic understanding of what this means, right? The object, he writes, of restoring lost property to its owner is obvious. Firstly, returning lost items is a good feature of someone's character. And secondly, it has mutual benefits. For if a person does not return the lost property of their fellow human being, then nobody will restore to that person something that you may lose one day. So there's this mutual understanding, and this is kind of what Yvonne was saying, right? Is if we are in a society where nobody returns anything, then yeah, it's true. I'm not going to return something when somebody else loses it, and I may keep that, but when I lose something, nobody's going to return it to me either. So there is a benefit to yourself for being in a society that has these sorts of understandings and agreement. You could argue it's the same benefit of having stoplights or stop signs, right? Because, yeah, it's annoying sometimes to have to stop. You're going down Delmar Heights, you're hitting every single green light, everything is awesome, and then you hit that first red light and you know every single red light afterwards you're going to hit. It's annoying. But the reality is that if we didn't have those red lights, we'd be stopping and having been stopped from accidents a lot more, right? So we create these agreements with one another that sometimes are inconvenient, but it's for the greater good. And I think that's what Rambam is arguing here. Maimonides is arguing that this is something that is for the greater good. But Bachya ben Yosef, Ibn Bakuda, sees it a little bit differently. He says restoring property is a fulfillment of the Torah's instruction to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's not just basic, oh, well, if I love him, he'll love me sort of thing. But it's this idea of having care for the people that are around us, to love the people that are around us, to think about the people that are around us. That's what, according to Bachya, this means. And he goes on, he says, loving one's neighbor means taking care of all that is important to them as you would want them to safeguard all that is important to you. We care for one another in this society. To me, that's sort of the next step in the development of this idea. In Sefer HaChinuch, he takes it even a step further. He says that this commandment of returning lost property is fundamental and all society depends on it. Because it's not just a matter of taking care of possessions or loving. What's important here is the matter of trust among human beings. By fulfilling this mitzvah, we're not just fulfilling the mitzvah, but we're creating a community, we're creating a society in which trust is there. In other words, trust exists. Now, obviously, trust can be broken. But at some point in time, we have to look at the person at the other end of that stop sign who's coming towards you and trust that they are going to stop too. And if we didn't have these stop signs there, that trust wouldn't be there. Is he going to stop? Am I going to stop? Is this going to be a game of chicken? I don't know. So that's the third step in the development, right? From basic, a binary give and take, to this idea of loving one another, to actually creating trust. And then you have the Hasidim who come later on, who take it even a step further. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoye says that the wandering ox and sheep are metaphors for people who have lost their way. So it's not just about a physical object that we are supposed to return, but we have an obligation to return that sense of direction, that sense of wholeness, that sense of self to somebody who has lost their way, as well as losing their property. And when we talk about losing our way, it's not just, I don't know the directions, but somebody whose life has taken the wrong path, somebody's life who's gone off, and we've met those people, we see those people, sometimes we felt it ourselves. The sense of, I just don't know where to go, I don't know what my next step is. And those moments, we need other people around us to help us. It's really hard to find our way out of that by ourselves. And this verse reminds us, you are not allowed to remain indifferent. When you see your friend, your neighbor, when you see your spouse, your siblings, when you see people you care about struggling, we can't just close our eyes. We can't just say, it's not my problem, I don't want to get involved. Because the society that we want to build, the families that we want to build, the friendship groups that we want to build require us to care, require us to look and to respond. Any comments or questions before we actually go into reading some of the other laws that are around this? It's interesting to see the context. I didn't want to get into that today, but the context of this vis-a-vis all the other laws that are talking about is very interesting as well. Any comments or questions before we go back to our reading? All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.